So welcome everyone. Thanks for coming out. So I'm Toriel. This is Alex Meng.
Hey.
We're going to talk a little bit about our experience going to GlueCon. It's a conference about DevOps. It was in like last month in Colorado.
May 21st.
So why should you go to conferences? I actually wrote a blog post about this. Basically, go to the next slide. One of the reasons is that like conferences help you as a developer grow. One of the biggest things I hear people say when why should I go to a conference? How do I go to a conference? They say my manager won't send me to a conference. Well, this is how you convince your manager to let you go to a conference. You tell them it's a team building activity. You don't go to a conference alone. Try and bring other developers with you from your team or from other teams in the office. It's a way to reduce costs. So if your manager says to you, like, hey, the conference costs too much to send you, you say, oh, but I'm going with 2 other people, we're going to share the hotel costs. So you're reducing costs right there by sending multiple developers to a conference. No doesn't always mean no. So when I went to GlueCon with Alex, it was actually just Alex going at first. And I actually had to ask multiple people to get my budget approved for GlueCon. And so this is why I'm kind of helping you know how to convince your manager why you should go. Also, if the budget thing is still an issue, try and find out discounts for the conference. There's several ways you can figure this out. Like one is if we're a sponsor, you basically can get discounted tickets for most conferences. For GlueCon, I got $200 off my ticket because Rackspace was a sponsor. Another thing is at Rackspace, you can find out what events we're sponsoring by emailing the marketing team. We basically just have an event marketing team who handles all of this. If you want to speak at a conference as an instant free trip, it doesn't even come out of your team's budget. You can talk to marketing and they will pay for your trip to that conference. So that's an easy way to attend conferences.
So more reasons to attend. Networking. Sam and I got to talk and meet a lot of really cool, really smart people from other companies. We actually got invited to a meetup after the GlueCon for Cassandra. So all the DataStax employees were organizing that. We ended up hanging out with those guys for a few days, hooking up with them on Twitter and Facebook afterwards. So you gotta eat the mic. All right. And then Rackspace was sponsoring, so we got to meet some other rappers. So that was great.
Renewed interest in projects. As a developer, you get bored of what you're working on, especially if you've been working on a project for 2 years, 3 years. You can't just keep on working on that project and be like super excited about it, unless you're working with like new technologies every day, or looking at new technologies, or looking how to do better on your project. So basically, over time on a project, your learning curve also goes down. You're learning less than what you were learning before, just because you've been working on it for so long. So conferences are a good way to gain like new insights for how you should be working on your project and what you should be doing. It's just a way to also renew your interest in your project, so that way you're always doing what's best for your project, rather than stagnating and not moving forward on what you're working on.
So education is obviously another huge reason to go. We were exposed to a whole bunch of new technologies, new ideas, new things to bring back to the team. It's a good validation of your own practices. Seeing all the same technologies that you use, used by other people is great feedback. Being a part of the conversation, I think, is really educational too. Being around other developers, being around other roles in the same types of companies, and then being able to contribute back, maybe doing your own talks or giving presentations like this afterwards. So what was GlueCon about? It was actually a lot of repeated topics throughout the talks. Docker. I don't think there was a single talk where someone didn't say Docker.
Docker was the future.
Or they did not say Internet of Things. There was a lot of talks on APIs, a lot of stuff on PaaS, IaaS, all that kind of stuff, all these buzzwords. There was a lot of stuff on DevOps. Those were actually the majority of the breakout. The smaller talks were just specific things in DevOps. So I think we just want to talk to you guys about some of the talks that we saw and go through some of those. So one of my favorite talks was a talk against SDKs and for APIs. The argument was basically your API should be so clear and so good that developers don't even need an SDK to get started. They should be able to use whatever HTTP library is in their programming language of choice, and they should be able to explore and use your API without the SDK. The argument was, if you make 5 SDKs for 5 different languages, well now you've got 6 things to maintain if you include your API. So anytime you make a change, you've got to make a change in every SDK. Now you're supporting all these different things. Maybe they're different versions. Maybe you haven't updated different ones. So basically the argument was just let the community do SDKs for you. If there's interest for Python, for using your API, the community will make that happen.
So one of the talks I attended was related to the rise of platform as a service and down with infrastructure as a service. The idea here being that you want to just, as a software developer, deploy your code and not really care about how it gets where it goes. And you want to host it somewhere, you just want to know that it works. So one of the things that we saw at GlueCon about this was basically the rise of building your own pass. So things that help you do this that we saw, there was a talk on something called Flynn. This is something that's being developed by DigitalOcean. Some of the developers from DigitalOcean, not necessarily DigitalOcean endorsed. But
The guy who made Docker.
no, that's different.
Co-creator of Docker Space.
Yeah, sure. Flynn is basically a split level hierarchy. Layer 0 is the service discovery and resources. And then layer 1 is the actual being able to deploy and maintain and monitor your applications. Flynn itself was, you can look it up on GitHub, but it's split into several small repositories, which is slightly confusing when you're trying to get started with it. Playing around with it myself, I wasn't able to get it working, mainly because it was split into so many different pieces that it was hard to get all the moving parts working together. It does have documentation, which was helpful, and they try to explain their ideas on how it works. It's also written in Go, so just a couple little tidbits about that. There was another one that I looked at called Dace. Dace is, again, another platform as a service. It's Heroku inspired. What this means is that it's more about like, here's my GitHub repository, turn this into an application that's automatically deployed. And so with both Flynn and Dace, these are Docker-based. So what that means is basically, at least in terms of Dace, you would have in your GitHub repository a Docker file that specifies what it needs to be able to run your application. And then that automatically, you would basically build your own pass, and if you give it your GitHub and your Docker file, it will automatically be able to deploy it to your application servers. I found Dace to be a little bit easier to get started with. It uses CoreOS as a base image, which is actually built by a couple of extractors. It was easier to set up. Both have dev environments, so both Dace and Flynn have dev environments you can use that you can set up via Vagrant. So it's interesting to, easy to get started with, although obviously I had trouble getting Flynn set up. So.
Cool. So more API stuff. Why developers hate your API? This was another really good one. So he kind of just had like a list of reasons that APIs suck. Let's see, bad documentation. So your documentation is inaccurate, it's incomplete, it's out of date. Lack of communication. So breaking changes without warning developers. Your API is really difficult to get started with. There's no hello world, there's nothing I can copy paste, I can't run a curl command, I can't just instantly get started. Your API has a lot of restrictions, legal restrictions, rate limits, just not developer friendly. It's unreliable, unresponsive, it's buggy, doesn't work the way you expect it to. It's too complicated. You're using custom protocols, you're still using SOAP, you're not supporting JSON, stuff like that. And then the biggest thing is not having a sandbox, not having a way to play with the API, especially if it has to do with monetary things or things that you can't necessarily just mock out on your side.
Another talk I attended was related to exposing API internals. And what this was basically about was, when you're building out an API, you don't want to expose every single thing in the API in terms of like a RESTful manner perfectly. What this means is, basically, if a developer has to drill down like 5 levels to get to a resource that they're trying to access, that's too hard. A good example of this is if you were to take, let's say I were trying to work against an API that returns me what I want is a duck, right? I want to work with a duck. When I query that API, I want to get the duck back because that's what I want to work with. Now, if the API is built in such a way that the duck is built up of many parts, so this duck is built up of gizzards, of beak, feet, etc., I don't want to have to query for the gizzards, the beak, the feet, etc. I want a duck. I want to work with the duck. So expose to me the duck. Don't expose to me every single little piece from the API. Build it up for me. If I have to go through interaction to get what I need from the API, it's too hard, too difficult. It's not worth using.
So another one was DevOps and cloud developers. This was kind of a contrast and comparison at the same time, sort of seeing the merger of DevOps against other developers who are working just purely in the cloud. So he was saying that both of them are using a lot of open source technologies now, especially a bigger shift in DevOps and sysadmins using more open source stuff. DevOps are developing through infrastructure. Configuration management and automated deploys are the new standard. We get a lot out of open source and open communities and an open culture. The real difference comes down to the worldview, one being code-centric, the other being system-centric, but really doing the same things.
Activating developer profiles. So this was another talk by a Google employee. For me, this is like kind of one of my favorite topics, more because I like the social aspect of being a developer. Basically, this was about like how developers learn about technologies in different ways, and that you have to, the way that, because they learn in different ways, there's different paths for success for a developer. What this means is that an enterprise developer versus a developer who's just an open source enthusiast versus a startup founder, they all have different profiles in terms of like how they learn technology and like what they need to get done. So an enterprise developer is probably more interested in like security and reliability and the fact that a technology has probably been around a little bit longer than just 3 months. Whereas a startup founder probably might be more interested in trying to get their product out fast, and so that means that they might use something that's a little bit newer, that's easier to get started with. The different ways that developers learn are through things like online courses, forums, tutorials, code samples, documentation. So those 5 things in different orders are activate different developers in different aspects.
Cool, so we're just going to go over some tools that we saw at GlueCon as well. There was a lot of vendors there outside of the talks that had different things they were trying to show.
So one of the cool tools I saw was Datadog. I think some people in this room are familiar with it. But basically Datadog is a monitoring as a service platform. So on OnReach we use cloud monitoring, and while it works for us, when I saw Datadog I was like blown away by the featuredness that it had. So basically, the monitoring solution they have is, it's a software as a service. They have plugins for tons of common software, and these plugins generate metrics and monitoring for you. So what happens is, like, they had plugins for things like Cassandra and several different services that we already run, like manual, so like MySQL or any kind of like Apache or web application. It's just plugins that you can put in really easily, and it picks up metrics automatically for you. And then on top of it, sending the metrics, it allows you to build custom dashboards So now what you have is this all-in-one monitoring solution, which makes it easier to handle alerts and monitoring. So on top of having custom dashboards already built into the software, so it's, the UI is 100 times better than Graphite. It also has, you can annotate the graphs at different points in time. So this lets you say like, oh, we had an alert that kicked off. Let me go look at the graph. Let me annotate the graph so we know what happened. And now we have documentation about, exactly what went wrong, how it happened. We have graphs to back it up. Pricing is based per server with max limit on metrics. But when I talked to them about like our setup, we have tons of metrics. They said that they can lift the metric cap. It's just to prevent abuse, basically. So.
Cool. So another thing that was a good talk about was Saltstack. Saltstack's actually pretty common at Rackspace. There's a lot of people using it already. But there's also a lot of people using a lot of other configuration management tools like Chef and Puppet and Ansible and all that stuff. So Salt claims to be faster than all of those, especially when you're scaling up to a lot of servers. It has a really powerful declarative orchestration engine. So unlike things like Chef, where you're not quite sure what order your resources will run in, Salt is really good at keeping the consistency. It has really mature exception handling too, so you can allow resources that are running to fail, and if you expect them to fail, that's fine. The run can keep going, and you can handle that in other ways.
Shippable. So when I saw shippable, I was really excited, but then I became less and less excited. Shippable is basically a Docker-based automation tool for testing. They let you basically just have your GitHub repository with tests set up and a configuration file, and you send it off to Shippable, and they can just on per commit or merge or whatever, it'll automatically run all your testing against a Docker container built for it. What I thought it would do is also deploys, but it doesn't, which was disappointing to me because I would have liked to. Huh?
Not yet, right?
Well, they said they were working on it, but they didn't have it yet. But I wanted to see that in version 1. Basically because after you've already built the Docker container to run your tests, why should it not be able to actually run the software?
So something that I had never heard of before was Mem Sequel. This is really cool. This is a distributed database system. So it runs entirely in memory. So it's meant just for real-time analytics and warm data. It's not meant for long-term storage type of things. It's meant to be paired with something else like Hadoop or whatever you would use to store and do batch analysis. And it also uses SQL, so you would have to learn a new language to implement it.
Also on Mem Sequel, they had really cool UI for managing Mem Sequel. It kind of blew us away when we were looking at it and just seeing that they were able to execute queries and see the performance through this UI that they had set up for it on hundreds of servers. So. Also saw something called ping identity. So right now on OnReach team, we're working on SSO, and we're having to learn this whole protocol called SAML, and it's something we've never worked on before, never seen, just getting started with it, XML based. Very annoying. Python doesn't work with XML great. There's no good libraries for it necessarily. And so when I saw ping identity and that they offered a SAML based solution, I asked as Dave, why did we not just go with ping identity? It would have been so much easier. And here we're also talking with several teams at Rackspace who are rolling their own versions of SAML to talk to our different control panels. And they're all using different languages, all different, who knows, how they're implementing it, if it's really, the right way or the wrong way. It would have been much easier if we had gone with some type of software as a service for this particular piece of software. Thank you.